Welcome to Software Sales Simplified, Move to Success, your weekly podcast for software sales professionals who want to sell better. Whether you are a seasoned pro or just getting started out, make Software Sales Simplified your home for insights, developments, and news in the world of enterprise software sales. I'm Kevin Donville, and I'm joined by my good friend and colleague, Matt Long, and together we have over 50 years experience in software sales, selling, implementation. We're happy you've joined us here today as we talk to industry experts, share opinions, and become better sellers together. But before we get started, if we could please remind you, take a moment, take a second, and please like, follow, comment, and subscribe on whatever platform it is that you're listening to us on here today. But without further ado, I do want to go back over to my good friend, Matt Long. Matt, how are you doing today?
I am doing fantastic today. We are getting some much needed rain in the dry side of Hawaii where I am. So it's all good.
Yeah, believe it or not, folks, there is a wet and dry side if you've ever been to that island, and they could not be more different. And speaking about things that are different, one of the things we're going to be talking about here is a topic a little bit different than some of the ones we've talked about in the past, but it does speak to our book and our methodology, Matt, the MOVE framework. We're going to be talking all about the aspects of value and particularly engagement and how important it is for software sales teams and the services delivery and enablement teams to be aligned for not just the immediate success for the deal, but also for the long-term health and prosperity. I know that's an important subject to you. Do you want to kind of comment on that before we get started, Matt?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in my mind, engagement is the most important thing because this is where you're actually working with the customer to communicate and reinforce all the things you learned through, discovering their motive, opportunity, and then the value mapping, right? So it's everything from your demos to your meetings, to your presentations, to your emails, and then, of course, to the transition over to services, professional services, making sure that that goes smoothly, and then they're able to understand exactly what the value the customer is trying to derive out of the platform. So I'm really glad to have Craig on to kind of talk about that handoff and specifically the things that you can do ahead of time as a seller to set them up for success. Because we all have seen like where deals sold, you take it, you just throw it over the fence. It's like, all right, have at it. And which doesn't usually go well. So I'm really happy to have this discussion with Craig today.
Absolutely. Craig, as Matt said, Craig is someone we've worked with in the past and someone we know understands the value of the different topics that we just described and outlined for you. But as much as we know Craig and respect him and love working with him, you guys don't know. So Craig, if I could be so bold, please take a moment, take the floor, tell everybody a little bit about who you are, what you do, and where you come from.
I'd love that. Thank you, guys. Really appreciate both of you having me today. So I'll start with, I'm currently heading up onboarding in the Americas for Contentsquare, which is, a SaaS behavioral analytics suite of products, basically. And I've spent just shy of a decade now in this post-sales SaaS analytics space. But my path didn't really start there. I have this creative background. I went to school for film and TV. I worked at an ad agency for a number of years doing digital production. And there's this sort of through line through all these sort of different jobs that I had, which is storytelling, which has always been so important to me. Actually, one of the first real jobs I had is I started my own company very early on, trying to produce a 3D animated children's series. I remember going to India to hire a production studio, starting my own company, and really dealing with all the complexities of building something from nothing. I remember we pitched to Nickelodeon, Cartoon Network, Disney, and it was just a really exciting time for me. But when it didn't get closed and we didn't sell the idea, I realized I needed to get a real job, pay the bills, and I was in a serious relationship at the time. So that was sort of my storytelling journey. But all of this eventually brought me to, I think what we're probably going to talk most about today was my role. I got hired to work at Clicktale as a consultant, which is sort of the early days of customer success. And that's where I really learned what it meant to be a white glove consultant for, one person army. So what that meant for me was being involved in not only the onboarding and the training of a customer, but actually doing some of the data analysis and building a strategic plan with the customer really seeing them through their whole total lifetime value cycle. And I won't go too much longer, but I'll just say that so much value, so much fulfillment felt uncovering insights for customers. Sometimes we'd find we'd uncover $1 million insight,
Mm.
and it gives you a lot of energy. And I took a lot of those wins and some of the successes that worked for me. I ended up running small success teams myself, but there was this constant pull that whole time towards onboarding and implementation. And the reason for that, I think, for me, is that I noticed very early on that my most successful customer engagements started very early on. It was really having a strong onboarding, having a great handover, having a scaffolding for which a success manager could really build on top of.
Mm.
And I was such a vocal advocate about the importance of onboarding that when the opportunity arose for me to sort of internally apply for the role, I moved over to the onboarding side of the house, and I haven't looked back.
So your consulting gig, then your experience in cutting your teeth in the software world, which clearly, obviously, major departure from animation, right? I mean,
Mhm.
or do they just naturally fit hand in glove with respect to it, right? What exactly did you kind of see as you were doing that white glove type of experience? And maybe you can elaborate on what that means a little bit for our listeners. What did you see and learn then that made you say, the engagement and the enablement is so important to the folks for their success going forward?
Yeah, I think seeing customers respond to my curiosity
Mm.
was, I think, the most exciting thing that I learned that I've sort of carried through to this role in onboarding. Asking, it may seem like a no-brainer, but just asking myself questions like, what is my exec sponsor hired to do? What are they being measured on? And ultimately, what happens if they fail? What does that mean for
Mm.
me? And there was just that required me asking a lot of challenging questions and making a concerted effort to learn their business. And what I mean by learning their business, I don't mean just learning how to interpret the data that we were collecting on our customers, but sort of thinking outside of the box about their vertical and about trends that are happening in their industry, and really bringing those topics to conversations so that every moment I had with customers was less about, hey, what do you want to talk about today? But it was actually more about, what can I tell you that's exciting? And I just found a lot of pleasure in doing that because customers were responding and we were renewing having those kinds of conversations.
Do you
Was
think
there
your
a common
storytelling background, how did that kind of influence the way that you communicate with the customers or even uncover these points? Because I could see as a storyteller, you have to really understand kind of the motivations behind it, what their journey is and all these things as you're telling a compelling story. So I imagine that curiosity that you expressed, right, has something to do with it. But can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, in a really, I guess, in a really tangible way, it doesn't matter what tool you use, but at this time, it was really my first foray into looking at things like session replay, which is a really interesting way of seeing a targeted user experience firsthand. And one of the things that inspired me was to sit back with a cup of coffee and just sit and watch users repeating behaviors over and over again. And I started to sort of see a lot of patterns in that. And even though you're not hearing a customer talk as they're frustrated trying to click a checkout, button, you start to almost pull out little archetypes of different types of frustration. And there are archetypes in storytelling. And that's the person who is pissed off right now and leaving a bad CSAT score. And you notice these patterns. And so I found ways to have fun with the data. And I also learned that when you do analysis, for better or worse, you can make the same data point you can portray it as a negative thing or a positive thing, depending upon how you tell that story. And obviously it behooves you to tell a positive story and ultimately drive real value for your customers. But yeah, just being open to those different behaviors.
So it's interesting you bring that up. I mean, obviously storytelling is very, very important to us. And I imagine when you're teaching someone, because you're on the enablement team now to make sure that the customers get off on that right foot and start working with the solution. Storytelling's got to be absolutely critical to your ability to communicate ideas, concepts, and success. How is that different than when you're working on the customer success team? How does storytelling also play a role there?
Yeah, I think probably it's probably worth talking a little bit about because early on, Matt, you were talking a bit about engagement and the importance of engagement. And I think the interesting thing about when you look at engagement is it requires like human intervention. It requires having a discussion with a customer about accountability and who's going to own certain outcomes. And I think that's very much where the customer success consulting muscle comes in. But the other side of that, which is enablement, is really about teaching your customer how to drive, where to click, how to execute in whatever product or platform you're selling. And both of those things are sort of two sides of the same coin. They can't live, they can't survive without each other. And so for me, and actually, I think a lot of times it's easy to sort of puff your chest up and feel very confident that, hey, my customer is logging in to my product. I have active users, I have adoption. And because of that, logins equals happy customer.
Mm,
And I learned through a few hard experiences along the way that unless you have a plan for who you're telling that story to, you can tell the greatest story in the world. But if you're not speaking to the right audience, you're sort of screaming into the ether and you're not going to deliver a meaningful outcome for a customer. So I'm very much focused on trying to, even during onboarding, to look at both engagement and the enablement side and how can I piece that together? Because at the end of it, I'm handing the baton to someone in customer success to continue to deliver value forever after. And it almost requires a little bit of a crystal ball because the customer doesn't know what they don't know yet,
mm,
haven't and even though they hopefully know their business very well, they don't have the creativity yet to think about how to maximize the use of whatever product it is that you're putting in front of them. That sometimes comes later. And so I think what's really interesting is almost having to preemptively think about questions they might want to ask before they actually ask them. And
mm.
that's what makes implementation so interesting. But you can't take those guesses in an educated way unless you're building that engagement plan early and you're talking to customers very proactively in the relationship.
Yeah, that's an interesting point because I've seen it happen both ways where, customer success manager, starts off the first kickoff call and just explains everything that we do and how it's going to go and the value you're going to get and all this stuff without even asking, kind of what you want to get out of it, right? On the flip side, though, like you said, the customer doesn't necessarily know all the strengths and the value of the platform or how it maps to their needs. So, you start asking them, well, what do you want to get out of it? All this stuff. And they don't know, right? So I think there's a real art to explaining and then also eliciting from them, as you go through to really get to the right point. What other tools do you use or what indicators do you have, that you need to do a little bit more digging or things like that as you're going through these types of meetings and this onboarding process, I should say.
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously, there's a ton of different sort of frameworks, certainly on the sales side, for how you do discovery and you identify pain for a
Right.
customer. And I've invested a ton of time, leading onboarding, trying to capture those inputs from the sellers because they're hopefully investing a good amount of time asking these questions of the customer. And for me, the emphasis has always been on how do I tell them selfishly what inputs I need to drive a successful outcome? But it's really for me. I spend a lot of time thinking about the persona that I'm
Mm,
dealing with
Mm.
on the call and who is the end user. And a lot of times these are highly sort of matrix organizations with a lot of bureaucracy and compliance and security. And for me, it comes down to just being a cool head and sort of steering the ship and asking myself, what is the reason that they bought? And if the seller can give me just enough of that information about what that initial pain is, that
mm,
is my entry point to sort of reaffirm and say, hey, this is what I heard during the deal cycle, but tell me more. Explain to me why this is such a priority for you. And one thing leads to another. It becomes an organic conversation. And if that curiosity is there, I actually think rather than tiptoeing around it, I think a lot of times people are afraid to have those conversations because they don't want to inconvenience a customer. They don't want to, they see their time as so valuable. And I agree with that. But over time, as you build trust and you build that advisor relationship to a customer, they actually appreciate someone who takes a little bit of extra time to take a step back and ask difficult questions before necessarily just, moving forward.
Yeah, I think it's a great point too. It's the same thing in sales. When you can come to that first call with just a point of view or some questions about things, that you can ask them, like, this is what I understand is going on in your industry, or from what the salesperson told me, these are the things that you care about. Are they still what you care about, or is that accurate, right?
Mhm.
And just starting there, it just creates so much more rapport, right, from the get-go, because they feel like you're really listening and trying to understand, right?
100%. And I've actually, something that I try to do is, even though I represent a company and a product that I'm trying to position to a customer, I constantly think about what are the questions I would ask in an environment that's agnostic of my product. Meaning,
Mm.
like, this company, this customer, this person I'm talking to ultimately really has a job to perform. And that job is bigger than, in their world, at least in their head, it's way bigger than just using Contentsquare or using any product that's out there. And as soon as I can acknowledge that, well, now we're having conversations about what they're trying to do outside of my product. And
Mhm.
then I can do my homework. I can digest that information that they gave me. And hopefully I have great ideas. And with experience over time, I've been able to sort of on the fly, connect the dots on how the product can solve those issues. But it's okay. Like sometimes I have to come back and digest it and come back with a proposal based upon what it is that I learned and delight them after the fact. But I think you almost have to not be so focused on the product and on the data and more focused on what their mission is first. You sort of casting a wide net and then narrowing the focus through further conversation.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I mean, the what you're describing there is all about understand the problem. Let's make sure, let's not try and look at it from the lens of our product. Let's understand what it is they're up against so we can provide better guidance and have a clearer vision about where our solution fits or doesn't fit relative to what they're trying to do. And that sounds like that's what you build your success plan on. How often do you see organizations, 'cause you've been with a few now, how often do you see organizations not execute well on developing that kind of a clear understanding and a success plan? And what do they put at risk when they do that?
Yeah, it's unfortunately it's more common than I'd like to admit. And a lot of times it has to do with the end users and the buyer. And
Mhm.
sometimes when I think about on the customer side, to me, the end users are like the tactics. They're the executors. They're delivering against a broader vision that the business has or that my sponsor has. But unless I'm really trying to address both and understand both what the sponsor needs intimately to fulfill their job, as well as what it is the end users are going to do to execute against that, you're putting yourself in a very reactive situation. Especially, like, to me, the renewal starts from the day that the dotted line is signed. And so something that I try and think about is if I haven't had a good handover and I haven't had a good sense of what it is that the customer wants to achieve prior to touching it in the onboarding or just post sales in general, where we fail in those instances is we end up spending many weeks, sometimes months, doing rediscovery. And that's, to me, that's a major loss in terms of time to value in the customer journey. The clock is ticking in a way, and you could even do like a cost value calculation of each day that they're not getting value relative to the investment they made with you, that they're not really getting value out of the relationship. And so to me, it's really important to have that information early because then I can hit the ground running without interruption. And I'm focused now on implementation execution as opposed to sort of frustrating them. And in fact, I've seen in some organizations and in just with certain client situations where that frustration can be pretty severe if sometimes the seller actually did do a great job doing discovery and they're talking to the customer and they're getting all these pain points. And it actually, the failure wasn't on asking the tough questions, but the failure was actually in how those learnings were communicated downstream
Oh,
to the
yeah.
post sales organization. And, we've walked into calls, I'll be the first to admit, where we start asking questions and they're like, hey, we've been talking about that now for 3 months. Like, talk to me about when I'm going to get training, when I'm going to get implemented. And, they mean business and I get it. And so I think it's asking the right questions early on, but then also how you translate those questions
Mm.
downstream as well.
You're talking about a very interesting ballet that gets danced with respect to trying making that customer successful. You and I have had some conversations about that, and Matt and I wrote about it from our perspective in the book. And being able to bring all those folks together, that critical failure you just brought up, where the hard question was asked, the information was gathered, but it was never passed along to the internal team to arm them properly to go forward with utilizing that inside of the success plan. How often do you see that happening, and who owns the development of that success, that engagement plan as you're going through the life cycle, and when does it change?
Yeah, I think I think there's a lot of different philosophies and approaches that one could take. To me, the call it the V10 of an engagement plan, or the early version of it,
Mm,
starts during the sales cycle. It's a pre-sales
agreed.
initiative, and it can be the account executive in partnership with a solutions consultant starting to craft that plan. Sometimes it's called an engagement plan or an account plan or success plan. There's a lot of different terms for it, but they
Hmm.
can start to build on it at the beginning. But then the V20, V30, and the actual translating outcomes, that's obviously the role of customer success. And so you're kicking the can down the road, and you're putting more on customer success, more on onboarding, by not addressing it very proactively early during the deal cycle.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen, it all depends upon the cost of the system that you're selling, right? And things like that. But we're talking about enterprise. So we're assuming that there's a substantial investment on both sides, both from a time and money perspective. But in those cases, I mean, there's been times where, bringing in the consultants and success people prior to closing the deal is helpful, right? Because part of it is, coming up with a valid implementation plan that the buyer or executive believes is going to happen, because a lot of times they believe in the value of the platform. They just don't believe that it's actually going to be implemented, right? Because there's too many of those. So one I'd like you to talk about is just when to engage that. And then secondly, the other thing I always try to involve myself in is every handoff call, the AE and the SE are on that call to kind of guide it and communicate and then give the gentle handoff over, right? As opposed to just sitting back and letting the success manager, who's coming in kind of cold, start asking these questions. I mean, I think that's a huge wasted opportunity as well. So first, just kind of talk about, when do you like to be engaged? When does it make sense to bring someone in prior to the close? And how does that handoff look when that happens?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I'm glad you brought it up, because I think, I think it works from both a success side as well as an onboarding perspective to bring in an expert. As a
Mm,
seller, it's just not possible to speak to every potential outcome. And I talked a little bit before about like working with really matrix organizations that have a lot of moving pieces. And in those complex enterprise environments, they put a lot of emphasis on not just the value, but like sort of the governance of the relationship. Like, how do I move this massive ship that has all this investment in it in a certain direction? And they've been talking to the AE, they've been talking to the SC, which are hopefully doing a fantastic job. But sometimes, I mean, I have sellers come to me all the time. They're like, hey, just honestly, we need some fresh blood in this conversation. We need someone who's
mm,
done a million enterprise onboardings already to give the customer some confidence that we have a plan, that we have both the resources, the timeline wherewithal, and the understanding of their business to be able to take it home. And so I've actually seen bringing in a CSM leader, or bringing in myself or an onboarding leader to those conversations. Um, I don't know if I have like the exact stage in the deal cycle that I could point to, but I think when the customer starts to get serious and they're now asking questions about execution and pricing, and hey, how are we going to technically bring this thing to life? Those are really great times to bring in an expert. And actually, even more so in competitive environments where maybe you're up against another provider, and of course, where we are going to beat them is because we're not saying yes to everything that the customer has. If we're just yesing them and telling them it's too good to be true, right? They can't take that seriously. But when you then have someone asking challenging questions about who is going to own these outcomes, who are the developers, when I give you these $1 million insights, which we're going to give you, who's going to actually deploy them? so that we can measure them, and who are the resources on your team involved in those things. And so I think that's a really good stage to bring in an expert, a consultant, CSM leader, onboarding leader, to challenge in a good way, sort of challenge the customer. And I think they tend to appreciate the discernment as opposed to just like sort of nodding and smiling along the way.
That's a very keen point there. So, the ownership of that, obviously there's going to have to be a handoff at some time. Before that gets handed off to you and your team, what do you feel must have happened, and what needs to be given to you? What must that plan contain before you guys can take ownership of it and then shepherd it through the rest of the life cycle?
Yeah, it's a valid question. So, and I started to allude a little bit to it, but I think the big thing is for me is what are the key business objectives sort of outside on a very macro level outside of my software? So examples in analytics space, there's analogies across all different types of software, but in the analytics space, things like, hey, I want to, we're having issues with customer satisfaction. And by next year, we need to increase our CSAT score by a certain percentage. That's a noble cause. That's a very high level objective. If it's an e-commerce customer, maybe they're really keen to, they have a certain conversion goal or revenue target for the end of the year. And so I need to understand what those objectives are. I don't want to hear things like my customer wants to understand their journey a little bit better, or they want to see where people are clicking. Okay, cool. Those are interesting data points, but they're not the why my sponsor was sort of hired to do their job. So I want to know what those things are. What are their pains at that level? If there are some ideas for tactics that we can like perform, like if they know there's certain tests that they want to do throughout the relationship or certain paths that they want to go, that's cool. That's helpful information. But the main thing is the objectives. And then I really want to understand who are the people to represent both the business needs. So like understands like their analytical needs, their business needs, sort of like a data steward, someone who really understands that information. And then in the case of onboarding and implementation, I want to identify like a tech champion. So who is the person that is going to action resources to partner with my team to execute downstream? But depending upon what you're selling to a customer, there's a million different inputs. And of course, the more that I ask for, the more burden that I put upon pre-sales and sellers to do. And so for me, something that we're starting to think about now, we haven't fully done it, is starting to build a bit more of like what I'd call like a maturity assessment or framework that we can use to not ask a million questions, but sort of curate the kinds of questions we ask depending upon the target audience that we're talking to. Because we have customers, sorry, I'm going long here, but we have certain customers that we know from the onset that they're really interested in our solution, but they've been very transparent that, hey, we don't actually have the resources to do this ongoing analysis. And so that doesn't mean we shouldn't have them as a customer, but what it means is our delivery model throughout the whole relationship and the way we approach that is completely different. In those instances, maybe I'm positioning professional services, I'm positioning other resources where I can sort of, show them value in a really tangible way. On the flip side of that, we get customers who are all about, hey, it's data democratization. It's take the training wheels off, train the trainer. I want my team to be hands-on in the data, and that scales really well for them. But of course, in that scenario, as an onboarding team, I'm thinking very differently about how I'm training that customer versus the other example that I gave to you, where I can spend hours training and doing these really interesting road shows, but they're never going to use the product. And so you need to have that moment of honesty with your seller and with the customer to really acknowledge those things head on.
Yeah, I mean that's a key point, and one of the things that we emphasize in our book, the Move framework, the opportunity is really can they execute, right? And hopefully, a good seller will qualify out or at least identify early on potential issues about them actually being able to implement, right? But we know that doesn't always happen because there's a lot of pressure. Just you got a deal, they got money, make it happen, right? It's like, so
Yep.
when have you come in or have you ever come, well, I know you've come in and seen it where there's a lot of red flags, right? Has it
Mhm.
ever stopped a sale? Or, I'm assuming that you have to be able to pivot, but have you seen it as like, look, they need X, Y, and Z. They don't have any of these things,
Right.
right? And, raising that early on, I think is really critical. But give us some examples of where you've come in and just realized maybe at the 11th hour that this is going to be very difficult to implement because of a lack of resources or infrastructure or anything else along those lines.
Yeah, it doesn't happen often to the extent where it will torpedo my deal, where we can't find a solution for the customer. But what it does do is I've had examples, I won't name specific clients though, where we've had to early on, even before the dotted line is signed, and I'm pulled into some of the calls that I mentioned to you beforehand, where I'm talking about how we're going to execute. And I've had to say on those calls, hey, listen, I'm going to give you these resources and we're going to train you and we're going to show you how you can reach these outcomes. And they've said something that, light bulb goes off where I'm like, hey, I'm talking to them, but they're not going to be able to do this thing. And so
Mm.
usually I try and be honest about that. I don't necessarily accuse them and say, hey, you're not going to be able to do this. But what I'll say is, let's think about building a strategy where we can supplement maybe in the first year, maybe they need a ramp up plan. So I'm going to come back to you with a plan. So for the first year, we're going to lean a little bit heavier on our services team to show you some of the wins that we can get and some of the value you can get out of the relationship. So I'm looking for creative ways to position professional services and the different offerings that we have to sort of bear the weight of that. And there's always that gray area too, where sometimes it's not that the customer is not willing to invest the resources, especially larger enterprises. It's not like, hey, we don't want to do this thing. Sometimes it's like, hey, we're starting to hire a role internally to take on these kinds of tools. Are you going to be willing to work with and train that person? And so I think there's ways that you can build a plan. And that's what the pivot is in a way. It's like there's a problem and it's not so linear. It's not black and white. So let's take a step back and figure out, is it supplemented with services? Do you need us to build a bit of a playbook with you? Do you need
Yeah.
to talk to another customer maybe who went through the same growth phase in their journey and now they're sort of a well-oiled machine. And so there's a lot of different strategies you can do. You can even position partners if you have a partner ecosystem. Sometimes, having a wealth of really strong partners that you've done great work with in the past is a great option, and it saves them the cost of having to sort of build their own, departments where those resources don't exist. So there's a few different ways you can skin that.
So, but clearly, if you don't ask that question, or more importantly, ask that question of yourself, not necessarily asking the customer, because to your point, they may not realize that they aren't really in a good position to execute. If you don't ask that question internally, and I guess sort of objectively of the opportunity, you could miss that they're not ready to execute. What in are some examples and maybe even some of the things that get put at risk as a result? I mean, could this completely take a deal off the rails and cause there to be like a complete failure, or is it what do you feel on that front?
Yeah, so I'll give you one example of, so this is actually more for an existing customer though, where we didn't necessarily translate the engagement plan or the success plan downstream
Mm,
well enough and ultimately lost the deal. So I won't name the customer, but I remember I was early on in my sort of CSM journey, but I was already telling great stories with data and I was doing great
mm,
analysis. And I had a customer who I was working directly with an analyst at the customer side, and we were doing an analysis of the impact of ratings and reviews on driving conversion. Not just in the sense that great reviews on a product is more likely to drive conversion. I think we can all agree with that, but it was more about
mm.
how curated reviews and how those are being positioned on the page relative to their conversion decisions. And so I delivered this amazing body of work to them. And the analyst said to me, Craig, this is the greatest piece of analysis I've ever seen, in some version of those words. And I was so proud of myself. I remember I went to the AE and I'm like,
Patting
dude,
yourself on the back there.
yeah, exactly. Patting myself in the back. I sent a bunch of screenshots I sent it to their manager, my manager. I'm like, man, we are crushing it. And I was just remember being so excited getting that feedback. And where I failed at the time as a CSM and failed in partnership with my account executive partner at the time is that none of that, none of those key business objectives, none of the things that really mattered to the sponsor were being, I guess you could say, like sort of managed up. They weren't being, there was no
Mhm.
cross pollination happening. So I was doing tons of these great pieces of analysis, but they never reached my exec sponsor. I wasn't translating them, and ultimately, it was too little, too late. Customer churned, and so since then, I've been really a big part of like my philosophy, both in the success side and on the onboarding side, is how do I look for opportunities to position any of the work that I'm doing. Again, going back to storytelling, how do I make sure that I'm telling these stories to the right people? Sometimes it's
Mhm.
an implementation story. It's because I'm working with a technical resource that is or a tech team that's highly resource constrained. Their business, the sponsor doesn't care about that. They bought the solution and they're expecting results. Well, they're not talking to each other for a long period of time. And 3 months go by, 4 months go by, we're not implemented yet. They're not going to their tech team and saying, why the hell haven't you implemented the solution? They're coming to us and saying, you guys screwed up. We're 4 months in and you've shown
Mhm.
us nothing at this point. And so I'm using that as an example just to say that if you're not having a conversation with the seller and you're not discussing that engagement plan and you're not speaking to the right people at all times, you're really dealing with a lot of risk and you're in a very reactive environment. I don't know if I fully answered the question, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you touched on some key points that I think Kevin and I have embraced over the years as well, which is communication to the buyer and the executive at all times, whether it's a monthly win report or something like that. And
Mhm.
obviously the quarterly business reviews is a key component as well. But
Mm-hmm.
even just, communicating and owning that conversation is critical, right? Because you could be doing the best job in the world, but they don't know that necessarily know that, right? So I think
Yep.
it's a key point. I do have another question I just thought of that is a little off topic and maybe a whole other discussion. But when Kevin and I started selling a long time ago, let's say, these are monolithic implementations where the software component was actually a small part and the implementation is sometimes 4x the cost,
Mhm.
right? That was the model on-prem, all these types of things.
Oh, yeah.
Slowly over time with SaaS solutions, it's like, oh, it's so easy. You don't have to all this stuff. And it kind of the services component kept dropping in terms of proportion to the
Mm-hmm.
software price, right? Or the SaaS price. To the point it also got extreme where it's like, we'll just implement everything for you. That's included, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so then you don't have room for services and all this extra stuff. I feel like it's kind of balanced out. I've been out of it for a while, but where are we now when you're selling, you know, with the SaaS solution, there's obviously some things that are included in that, but there's also additional services that are required, or all of a sudden you realize midway through that you need a managed service on this thing, right? And you have to charge for that because you just have budget for that. That's not part of your where does that kind of fit right now in what are you seeing in the market and what are people and clients going for when it comes to those types of discussions for services?
Yeah, no, it's great. Even in a world that's now everyone all they're talking about is automation and AI and information at my fingertips, I think there's still a lot of hunger for services, particularly not even so much in doing the work for customers, but more in sort of built crafting that engagement plan over time and thinking about their overall strategy and execution. And but you know, I'm finding that there's no real issues with sellers still positioning services. In fact, and the correlation between selling those services and the likelihood to retain customers being significantly higher. Like,
Yeah.
I think the math still bodes well for
Mhm.
professional services. But what I do see being a challenge just in the industry is when companies' incentive structure as a company, as a cohesive unit, isn't designed to encourage services, that can become very problematic. If your sellers are not motivated to position those services, then that can introduce a lot of friction. So I think you want to create an ecosystem where CSMs are really focusing on retaining customers. You have sellers that also value from retaining those customers, and they get some value from positioning services as well. And then everyone benefits in the end. And in those deals where we've done a great job for services, we end up being asked, they want more of it. I mean, they want to expand the use of services. But something that interesting that often happens too is it's important that you manage the use of those services too, because you got to have a plan for how you're going to execute. And I think that's where partnering with customer success is so keen or so important, because you can promise the world and have this, sort of time and materials expectation on your team. But if you don't deliver it, now you're going to be in a world of hurt, a downsell scenario or something like that.
No, I couldn't agree with you more. And Craig, we've had this conversation both when we were working together and in preparation for us talking today, just how important it is that the compensation structure of an organization not be set up in such a way that it creates an adversarial relationship between the people who sell it, the people who deliver it, and then the people who have to renew it as they're going forward. All of them have to share in the mutual success, or else they look at each other as, hey, man, you're stealing money out of my pocket here, or you're putting my deal at risk by putting that together. So I absolutely understand what you're saying from that perspective. And it's something that Matt and I get very passionate about. In our leading up to our conversation today, I kept telling you about, the areas we've got in our book and how we've learned those through pain, through personal pain of watching either deals go south that didn't need to, implementations that never got off the ground correctly, and renewals that were dead before we even implemented the software. So I can fully embrace what you mean by that. And we could probably go on for a whole other show just on that topic alone, sharing horror stories about that one. But we can't, as much as I would love to. But before we start to wrap up for today, you've really experienced a lot, even though you had a whole other career before you started working in customer success and in enablement. But as a result of that, I think it's been very deep, rich, and very rewarding. If someone wanted to improve engagement immediately, whether you're talking on the sales side or on the CS side, where do they need to look first inside their organization and their flow? Where should they start looking first to improve customer engagement?
Yeah, I think there are sort of two. I'll try and be brief, but there are sort of two answers to that. One is, I think that it's a no-brainer, but I think it's leadership within success and sales needs to come together, and success has to document and position those inputs that they need to be successful. So if they're seeing a pattern with, I'm just making it up, with certain e-com clients or certain things that they need that information to be able to drive success with that customer. They have to say it. They have to give, it's a partnership. It's giving sales the tools to get the information that's most pertinent. And so I think designing that framework for the kinds of questions and answers you want during the sales cycle, and then you can partner together. Something that I've done has been trying to co-author with sales a handover process that is not, it doesn't require so much overhead to maintain, where it's a set and forget, and building sort of a rhyme and a reason, like a rhythm to that, where they know each time deal closes, this is the process that I follow, this is the template, the information that I require. And I think sales and success partnering at a leadership level to design those things just takes a lot of the cognitive load away from sellers. So I think taking those small steps are really big. But in terms of I don't know if that necessarily solves engagement alone. To me, what really does that is on the success side is thinking, I think it's about knowing your customer cold. So I'll give you an example. Like if I were building a new customer success organization from the ground up right now, it might seem like a no-brainer, but if you don't know the customer's ACV to the dollar, if you don't know when they're up for renewal, you can't rattle off within a few seconds what the customer's 2 or 3 most important objectives are for the year. You can't articulate the critical players within their tech stack. Then you're not going to have an engaged customer. And so you need to know the table stakes. And then you need to build a culture of curiosity. And you were asking how you can do it instantly, but I think if you build a culture and encouraging people to go out and research things, we actually talked about at the very beginning of the show, where we were talking about, in a way, like read the news on your customer. There's seismic shifts within different verticals all the time that are disruptors within our customers' worlds. And just literally bringing those shifts up, bringing the news to the customer. Hey, how did this event impact you? How is it changing the way you guys are thinking about doing business over the next year? Suddenly, it opens a dialogue. And now a million bells are going off in my head about, wow, our solution can answer like 50% of the things they just mentioned to me. And so I think it's relating to their business. It goes back to being a genuinely curious person and encouraging curiosity within your organization. And some of that you have to hire for too. You have to have people that are hungry and that enjoy asking those questions. But that's where I would start.
No, I totally get it. And that whole thing about be curious. So that's the one thing that when I was on the enablement team for internal enablement, how do I train people to be curious? It's a hard thing to do. And if they aren't naturally curious, how can I help them fake it so they could be successful and help the customer get there? So let me just quickly recap some of the things that we've been talking about, because they were all fabulous concepts and ideas that we were talking about. It was all about how that engagement starts early with respect to before the deal even closes. You said when the ink is dry, and I remember we had a whole philosophical conversation about that in preparation for our call today. I say it was even before that, when with respect to as everyone's coming together and it looks like this is going to become a real deal, that's when it begins. But it's clearly not 6 months down the road after they've signed the contract and now you want to go get the renewal. And that the buyers, the users, the sales executive team, the delivery teams, they all need to be aligned, and they need to be aligned early with respect to what the sale is all about and what they need to deliver to make that customer successful. And that execution plan keeps everybody accountable to them actually delivering on that. So great words of advice and wisdom. And Craig, like I said, you and I could probably be here for hours just talking about why this is so important, and horror story after horror story about when they've come off the rails. But we do need to bring our show to a close here today. And before I do, Matt, I wanted to turn the floor back over to you. Anything else you'd like to ask or say before we go and close today?
No, the only thing I would add, and I think we've already talked about this, is that I believe that this is the most critical thing when you're coming to software sales, is that handoff and a start on their onboarding and enablement, et cetera. Because I've seen it a number of times where I've worked a year to close a deal and to map everything, get everything aligned and hand it over, and it drops, and then they're churning, or like I'm getting a call in 4 months, like, what did you sell me? You guys lied, all these types of things that don't have to happen, right? And it's no one's fault other than there wasn't a continuous just a progression of this customer being pushed to other parts of the organization. So really appreciate everything you do, Craig, and everything you talk about, because that for me is the critical thing. Because we can't get the renewal or anything without this work. So thank you.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Good stewardship is the key and the name of the game with respect to long-term success and customer satisfaction. Craig, if anybody wants to go and reach out to you and pick your brain a little bit more or learn more about what it is, your philosophy and some of your experiences, what's the best way to reach out to you?
Yeah. I think the best way is probably just on LinkedIn, Craig Bloom. If you just type in Contentsquare, you'll see me there. I'll be the first to come up. And if you have 5 minutes and you're bored and you want to look at the cartoon series that I worked on many years ago that I was referring to at the beginning, it's called Tunnel Riders, and it's on YouTube, and it's a fun thing that I like to show off every now and again.
We'll make sure that both of those references get put in the baseline, the detailed information about this episode. But Craig, thank you so much for coming in and being our guest today. It was so much fun and it was so inspirational to talk about. I can't thank you enough for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me. For me too.
And thank you to the folks that decided to spend a little bit of their day watching with us here. Please let us know what you thought of today's episode. Leave comments down below. And please remember to like, follow, subscribe on whatever platform it is you're looking at. And if you'd like to learn a little bit more about how Matt and I feel about this whole area of the customer engagement, feel free to go up to our website and buy a copy of our book, The Move Framework, where we have a whole section dedicated to just that kind of philosophy. But until then, ladies and gentlemen, we want to thank you for coming in and spending a little time. Please do join us again at our next episode. Until we see you again, Have a great time. Bye-bye.